Thank you so much for being here. Should I use this one or this one? Does it matter? Pretty well. How about now? Still good? They might get feedback. Well, it's a delight to be here with you, and I'm honored to be the inaugural lecturer here for the 100th TI Chapter. It's also the 800th year of the anniversary of the birth of St. Thomas, and so we're going to be learning some of what he has to teach us about how to be a good friend today, which is the title of the talk. And we'll also be leaning a lot on Aristotle. So let's dive in. The talk is titled, How to Be a Good Friend, Combating Envy and Apathy, Exercising Love and Wisdom. I will first discuss the relationship of friendship and human flourishing. I aim to show how living with an adequate vision of human flourishing is essential to being a good friend. This theoretical groundwork sets up my discussion of two virtues that build and maintain friendships, love and wisdom, and two vices that harm or end friendships, envy and apathy. My general advice today for how to be a good friend is to understand true human happiness, avoid these vices, and pursue these virtues. If this sounds too abstract, I beg your patience. The talk will get very practical eventually. To proceed, let's now turn to work that motivates the importance of friends and then turns to the nature of human flourishing. Robert Waldinger is the director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, which followed men from their teenage years at Harvard into their 90s. It's still underway and it's one of the longest studies of its kind. In summarizing the results as reported by the Harvard Gazette, Waldinger said, "Loneliness kills. It's as powerful as smoking or alcoholism." He also said, "The surprising finding in this research is that our relationships and how happy we are in our relationships has a powerful influence on our health. And also, taking care of your body is important, but tending to your relationships is a form of self-care too." And that, I think, is the revelation. The main lesson here is that the long-term health, or that long-term health, is greatly influenced by the health of our relationships. And of course, health is an important ingredient in human flourishing, although it is not flourishing itself. We can be healthy and still not be flourishing. You probably don't need a study to tell you that loneliness isn't great for you. But the study helps us appreciate, maybe in a new way, the importance of friendship to flourishing. I propose that there is a connection between a person's view of human flourishing and his or her notion of friendship. Inadequate views of human flourishing can lead to inadequate views of friendship. If we don't get flourishing right, we may not get friendship right either. We should care about getting both right then. And so I'll now discuss some examples of inadequate notions of human flourishing and friendship, and then turn to what I take to be the best accounts of both. It's evident that we all want to flourish. We all want a good life. But it isn't obvious what such a life consists in. So we must think carefully about what it is and how to get it. And to get us thinking, let's go back to ancient Greece and attend to the philosophy of Aristotle. Aristotle was a 4th century philosopher who lived during the golden age of Greece. He was a student of Plato, who was the student of Socrates. He wrote learned treatises on a great number of subjects. These treatises were so insightful and penetrating that some of them exert significant influence up to this day. Even if you think he's mistaken about the good life, he's worth paying attention to. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle observes that every person acts for an end, that is, a goal. For example, eating dinner after this talk may be an end or goal of yours. You'll have to choose various means to reaching your goal of eating dinner, such as figuring out where to go, how to get there, and what to eat. If you're asked, why are you going to eat dinner? Answers you might give include, I enjoy eating, I need energy, I want to hang out with friends. So eating dinner isn't merely an end of yours. It's also a means to something else, such as gaining energy or spending time with friends. We pursue means and ends all the time. The ends we pursue are sometimes means to further ends. Let me illustrate further. Suppose I ask you, why are you taking courses at NDSU? You might say, because you want a degree from here. I then ask, why do you want a degree from here? And you might say, because I want a good job. And so then I ask you, why do you want a good job? And then you might say, so that you can support yourself or perhaps a family. And then I ask you, why do you want that? At this point, you may be a little puzzled, maybe not. If you're like my students, then they'll start to give answers like this. I want a good life. I want to be happy. Or something like that. If I were to then ask you, let's suppose you answer that way, why do you want that? Why do you want a good life? Why do you want to be happy? You would probably find yourself without another answer to give. And you would say something like, well, that's just what I want. We've reached what Aristotle calls the final end, or the chief good, the end of all your other ends. Aristotle observes that there has to be something we treat as the final end or chief good, something that's not a means to anything else, but simply is an end. If we didn't have a final end in mind, we would never begin anything, he says. Furthermore, Aristotle thinks that human beings desire everything else for the sake of their final end. He says that we all agree in general about what the final end is. It's a good life. It's happiness. What he calls eudaimonia. Everyone desires this. Everyone desires, as we say today, to live his best life, or to live her best life. So, if we all want happiness, then one of the most important questions we need to answer is, in what does happiness consist? What is the best life to live? If you ask different people the question, you'll likely get different answers. Someone might change his answer depending on what is going on in his life. If he's sick, for example, he might think the answer is health. Aristotle considers different answers before offering his own. I'll mention two answers he rejects, and then discuss their potential implications for how a person views friendship. The first answer to the question, what is a good life, is a life of enjoyment. On this view, the best life is one with the greatest sensory pleasure. For example, enjoying good food and drink, having stimulating experiences, Instagram-worthy vacations, etc. Aristotle acknowledges the goodness of pleasure or enjoyment, but he says that a life of sensory enjoyment is not enough for us. He says it's a life fit for cows, but not human beings. What does he mean? If we were to ask what makes for a happy cow, we'd probably say that the best cow life requires food, drink, shelter, the comforting presence of other cows, and making baby cows. That's enough for a cow. But a human being could have ready access to the pleasures of food, drink, shelter, society, and sex, and still be unhappy, unfulfilled. Well, these pleasures have their place, and our sensory pleasures are greater in scope than a cow's. Aristotle claims that to live for sensory pleasure alone is to live as if the cow's best life is our own best life. But we're not cows, and their good life is not ours. Consider, though, how we might view friends if we held this view. Suppose we lived for sensory enjoyment, and we ordered everything we did to gaining the most enjoyment we could. On this view, it would be tempting to view friends as playing an important role in our happiness through being enjoyable to us. We might value them merely as a means to the joy they bring us and into our lives. And if they cease to bring joy to us, we might move on and find more enjoyable friends. But I submit that this is a shallow form of friendship that will, like the vision of happiness as enjoyment, leave us unfulfilled and not the kind of people that would be good friends. Of course, it's a good thing to enjoy your friends, but we shouldn't care about our friends merely because they bring us pleasure or enjoyment. A second account of the good life holds that the best life is being wealthy. Aristotle recognizes the goodness of wealth, but he says that wealth cannot be the final end, for wealth is clearly desired as a means to something else. People want wealth to buy houses, cars, clothes, entertainment, travel, education, etc. Wealth is not desired for its own sake or as a final end, properly. Therefore, it cannot be what happiness ultimately consists in. This may strike you as a surprise, given it appears that many people order their life around accumulating wealth. Some wealth, or another means of access to the goods it can buy, is necessary for a good life. We need food, clothes, and shelter to survive. We need a suitable education to thrive. Usually, money is the means of securing these things, and so we rely on money to some extent. But the best life requires much more than having the money to meet those basic needs, as we can see in the lives of the many unhappy wealthy people there are. We cannot treat money, which is merely a means, as the final end of our life. How might we view friends on this view? If our lives were ordered around accumulating money or what it can buy, we would be tempted to view our friends as merely useful to us in advancing our careers or helping us to secure greater wealth. We might value them as merely a means to the wealth they help us to secure. But I submit that this is a shallow view of friendship too. It will, like the view that wealth will make us happy, leave us personally and socially unfulfilled, and not the kind of people that would be good friends. That's not to say that our friends should never be useful to us. But we shouldn't care about our friends merely because they are useful to us in getting what we want. Many people might live with a combination of these two views. They take sensory pleasure to be the highest good, and wealth is the most important means to achieving a life of sensory pleasure, and they only pursue friendships of pleasure and usefulness. What is happiness for Aristotle? Aristotle understands the good of something to depend on the kind of thing it is. So the good or flourishing of a human being will depend on what a human being is. The good of a cow will depend on what a cow is. The good of a tomato depend on what a tomato is, and so on. The good of a human being will differ from the good of a cow or a tomato. In order to answer the question, what is a good human life? Aristotle's first step is to ask, what is a human being? For, he reasons, if we can figure out what a human being is, then we'll be able to figure out what makes a good human being, and so what makes for a good human life. To answer the question, what is a good human being, Aristotle says we must identify the characteristic activity of human beings. If we know this, then we can determine what makes for a good human being. He claims that things flourish when they perform their characteristic activity well. For example, playing the guitar is the characteristic activity of a guitar player. To play the guitar well is to flourish, in a sense, or to be good as a guitar player. What is the characteristic activity of the human, or the human being? Aristotle argues that it is the activity of using our reason. By reason, we come to know important truths and make choices that transcend our instincts. Our reason is what makes us distinct from the other animals, despite their impressive cognitive powers. Our reason is what brings a governing unity to the use of our other capacities and to our lives. We typically identify more with our reason and choices based on reason than on our immediate desires and emotions. Recall the last time you broke a diet out of an impulsive decision. If you berated yourself afterward, wasn't it because you identify more with your deliberate, rational choice that you made to make the diet than your impulsive desire when you broke it? Aristotle argues that if the activity of reason is the human characteristic activity, then we flourish as human beings when we use our reason well. Using our reason well includes understanding things, making good choices, fostering reasonable emotional responses regarding the situations and people we encounter and the actions we pursue. And he calls these activities in accordance with reason. He calls the habits that dispose us to activities in accord with reason virtues. Virtues are then good habits of thinking, choosing, and emotionally responding that are essential to human flourishing. They make us able to do reasonable things reliably, easily, and with pleasure, or at least without pain. Aristotle argues that a good life is characterized by such virtuous activity, and that this will be done with friends. He argues that his account explains what is plausible in the other accounts while avoiding their weaknesses. He claims his account will lead to an overall enjoyable life, although enjoyment is not its goal. For a person who gains pleasure from doing virtuous activity will enjoy much of what she does. Furthermore, she will be free from the significant internal psychological conflict and pain that characterizes the unvirtuous. Aristotle claims that virtuous activity may require some measure of wealth, and depending on the circumstances. For example, practicing the virtue of generosity through hosting a dinner party for friends requires you to possess wealth beyond meeting your most basic needs. Finally, Aristotle's account is applicable to many different states of life. A life characterized by virtuous activity could be lived out as a business person, a stay-at-home parent, an author, musician, engineer, computer science, whatever, go on and on. All could lead this kind of life. The wealthy and the unwealthy could walk this path. Those with power and public influence and those without could do so. They all must live a life of virtuous activity with friends, but the circumstances in which those virtues are exercised will differ according to the individual. Now let's turn to friendship. What is friendship? Friends are vital for our flourishing because we're social animals who need each other for good lives. Aristotle's basic notion of friendship is that it's a relationship characterized by mutual goodwill, of which both parties are aware, that's based on some likeness between them. Aristotle distinguishes three kinds of friendship. The first two will sound familiar. Here's a summary. The first are friendships of utility, which are based on mutual benefit. The second are friendships of pleasure, which are based on mutual pleasure. The third are complete or virtuous friendships, which are based on mutual love for the other for his or her own sake. That is, for his character or who he or she is as a person. In this friendship, there's a likeness of character between the friends. Aristotle notes some similarities and differences between these three kinds of friendships. Friendships of pleasure or utility are not necessarily bad, but they are incomplete friendships. They're good. The good and the bad have them. They're not necessarily long-lasting. They're quick and easy to form and dissolve, and they're possible with many. By contrast, he says only the good have complete friendships. Complete friendships are long-lasting. They're slower and more difficult to form and dissolve, and they are rarer and possible only with a few. In short, the fullest and most complete kind of friends, let's call them good friends, are those who we care about for their own sake and not merely because they are pleasant or useful to us. We say to these friends, I love you for who you are as a person, not merely because I enjoy doing things with you or because our relationship is mutually beneficial. Again, it's not that friends cannot also be pleasing and useful to us, but these are not the bases for complete friendships. Such friendships depend on both people pursuing a genuinely good life and forming a character growing in virtue. Such friends will want to be with each other. It's the good friend who will sacrifice his own pleasure or benefit for the sake of his friend. Aristotle writes, and I use the translation by Roger Crisp here, that for his friend, a good friend will sacrifice money, honors, and in general the goods for which people compete, procuring for himself what is noble. In fact, she is even willing to die for her friend. Consequently, if we want to summarize Aristotle's view of human flourishing, the good life of happiness, it's that flourishing is a life characterized by virtuous activity with good friends. Notice that the account of human flourishing built on virtuous activity fits well with the account of human friendship based on love for the other person's own goodness as a person. Fundamentally, what we are living for makes a difference for the content and direction of our character. If my life is oriented towards pursuing what is genuinely good in itself, then I will be both attracted to and attractive to those who are also pursuing what is good. What we are ultimately living for shapes the persons we become. The person we are determines what kind of friend we will be and what kind of friends we will attract. You might be worried at this point and think to yourself, okay, to flourish, I need good friends. But to have good friends, I need to be flourishing through virtuous activity. But I'm not virtuous. Am I stuck with a life of loneliness forever and doomed to unhappiness? How can I form good friendships given where I'm at? Can these friends help me to grow in virtue even where I lack it? It's arguable that Aristotle might give a gloomy answer to these questions, but I think there's reason to hope. I think good friendships do not require both friends to be virtuous or fully virtuous, even if they do require that both parties share a reasonably similar vision of human flourishing. If one person is ultimately living to acquire wealth and another is seeking to become good and to do good, then I doubt they will reciprocate the love needed for a good friendship or a complete friendship. However, if both parties are striving for virtue and seeking to do good, then I think they can have a good or complete friendship and help one another along the way. In sum, good friends help us to become good. I'm going to mention some of the benefits of good friends here, and then turn to the virtues of a good friend and vices that undermine friendship. Aristotle discusses some of these benefits, and an author named Paul Waddell discusses more. And drawing from them both, here are some benefits of the good friend. The good friend helps us to grow in love, know ourselves, especially our strengths and weaknesses. They encourage us to keep our eye on the goal that we are living for, and living for, and accompanying us on the journey. They provide companionship during the storms of life and the triumphs of life. They help us to avoid mistakes, especially when we're young. They increase our capacity to think and act in doing great and noble deeds, especially in middle age. And they help us to finish work we've begun that we cannot finish, especially when we're old. I will say more about how friends help us to grow in love, and because almost all of you here are young, to avoid mistakes. For the next part of the talk on virtues and vices related to friendship, we'll include and bring in St. Thomas Aquinas, the medieval philosopher and theologian. For Aristotle and Aquinas, happiness goes beyond pleasure and wealth, as well as health and honor. It must be a life that befits and fulfills our nature as rational and social beings. But for Aquinas, unlike Aristotle, virtuous activity with friends in this life alone cannot perfectly fulfill us. We will still have trouble and face disappointment and death here. There will always be some reasonable desires left unfulfilled in even the best of lives here. If we were to be perfectly fulfilled, he says, we must enjoy everlasting and perfect virtuous activity with friends, where God is the first and best friend that we know and love forever in eternity. Now I'll focus more practically on the two virtues to pursue and vices to avoid to be a good friend. The virtue most needed for friendship is love. Aristotle writes, since friendship consists more in loving than being loved, it appears that loving is the virtue of friends. To be a good friend, you must love the other person for his or her own sake rather than simply because they're pleasant or useful. In the Christian tradition, to love a person for his own sake is called charity. Charity essentially refers to the love of God for his own sake that God gives by grace. Hence Aquinas writes, quote, it is evident that charity is the friendship of man for God, unquote. This love overflows into the love of neighbor. For Aquinas, to love someone is to will his or her good. This is something called, or sometimes called, benevolence, which means to will the good of. So for our purpose, we'll think of charity as the disposition to will the good of another for his or her own sake. Notice that this makes an act of charity a voluntary act. It's not the emotion of love, although that emotion may accompany it. In a complete friendship, there's mutual attraction to the other due to their good character. Loving a person for the kind of person they are helps us to grow in charity by helping us to focus on someone other than ourselves, and through meeting the demands of friendship through personal sacrifice for the sake of the friend. To grow in charity, you must also expand the scope. We must also expand the scope of our charity to include everyone. Every human being, as a human being, deserves basic charity. To will the highest good for a person is to will their ultimate flourishing. This is to will that they too would have a life of virtuous activity. Such a will is necessary for complete friendship, but we ought also to will the good of those who are not our friends. Why? We have charity for ourselves. We will our own good for its own sake. And others are human beings like us, willing the good for themselves like us. And their flourishing consists in virtuous activity with friends like us. Hence, they're relevantly like us. We ought to treat them with the same basic goodwill with which we treat ourselves. And doing so, in fact, will help us to grow in love for our friends. Given this, the most important piece of advice for how to be a good friend and to gain, keep, and not lose them is to love them with the love of charity and grow in that love. Now let's look at two vices contrary to charity and so to friendship. What is a vice? Vices are unfulfilling habits that contribute to unhappiness. Vices are formed by repeated bad choices, such as choosing something wrong, failing to do what is right, failing to correct our unreasonable emotional responses, and so on. Vice makes it easier for us to make bad choices and to respond poorly to situations, contributes to self-deception, and so undermines our own good and the good of others. The vice we'll focus on first that undermines being a good friend is called spiritual apathy. It's also called sloth or sloth. Apathy means without pathos, to lack love, care, or concern. In his On Evil, Thomas Aquinas defines spiritual apathy as a habit of sadness or pain at a spiritual and interior good. Let's unpack this definition. This sadness or pain is not simply emotional, but involves a tendency to deliberately withdraw from such goods when one should not. Spiritual and interior goods, in contrast with material goods, are not seen, tasted, or touched. They are goods such as knowledge and friendship. You can see the effects of knowledge and friendship, but you can't see the knowledge itself, although you can see the book. Nor can you see the friendship itself, although you can see the friend. Knowledge and love for a friend are interior to us. Spiritual apathy is a disordered avoidance of and sadness at such goods due to a lack of proper love for them. Since spiritual goods such as knowledge and friendship are crucial to happiness, spiritual apathy is a significant cause of unhappiness. In her excellent book, Glittering Vices, Rebecca DeYoung calls spiritual apathy fittingly resistance to the demands of love. There can be various sorts of spiritual apathy. Aquinas focuses on one kind of apathy, apathy about our love for God, whose friendship is the ultimate source of happiness. I'm going to focus on apathy about love for human friends. The spiritually apathetic person is saddened by and withdraws from his love for a friend and what that love requires. He doesn't care enough for the friendship. But how is one saddened by a friendship? A person is saddened because the friendship is seen as bad in being an impediment to something else that's desired. When I'm apathetic about my love for a friend, it may be because what love requires of me gets in the way of my own comfort or plans or desires, which I care about more, in this case, say, than my friendship. The apathetic person is saddened because she treats the friendship as imposing a burden on her. For example, two friends have committed to sharing a morning coffee once a week, but one of them habitually chooses to sleep in because the comfort of staying in bed outweighs in her mind the good of keeping her commitment to the friend. To go deeper, The love for a spouse requires commitment and willingness to change. If a husband doesn't love his wife enough, then that commitment and change will be burdensome and so bring a certain sadness or even resentment. The apathetic are saddened primarily due to a lack of love, and not simply because they're averse to the work it requires. They failed to cultivate love as they ought. When Aquinas speaks of sadness, he has in mind more than just the emotion of it. Sadness also refers to the freely willed withdrawal from something. It manifests itself as desire and choice to avoid what love requires. This choice to withdraw from love or the choice not to foster that love are choices for which I'm responsible and contribute to the emotions of sadness that may occur as a result. How does spiritual apathy contribute to unhappiness? Well, it's unreasonable and unfulfilling when I'm spiritually apathetic because I'm failing to do what love or duty requires, and I'm treating something less important as more important than it truly is. Here's a slightly more detailed case from the above. Suppose I'm comfortably relaxing and my friend calls and really needs my help. Suppose there isn't a good reason for me not to help. What's holding me back is that I don't want to sacrifice my comfort to help my friend. I'm apathetic if I fail to love my friend by sacrificing my comfort for him. Acting out of love for my friend was the greater spiritual good I was avoiding by refusing to help him. Even if I do help, spiritual apathy can make me really sluggish to do what love requires. And clearly this isn't conducive to being a good friend, which is part of my flourishing. So I'm acting contrary to my flourishing when I'm acting with spiritual apathy. Aristotle notes that we cannot stay long in a state of sadness. Since apathy makes us sad, we will either seek to escape from that which makes us sad or distract ourselves from thinking about it with something pleasant. These two responses are manifested by either laziness or busyness. We usually associate spiritual apathy with laziness, with giving up in despair and doing nothing. The typical image of the slothful human being is the couch potato, watching television. But we can also seek to escape the source of our sadness by distracting ourselves with many activities. We can rush about doing many things and feel some measure of satisfaction at our supposed productivity. But this only avoids the more important issue we should face and increases our apathy. Good friendships persist because the friends are willing to face the hard things friendship requires them to face. Our avoidance behaviors can make spiritual apathy a gateway vice to other vices like greed, gluttony, and lust. Why those? Because they each involve things we find very pleasant: money, food, and sex. And we seek pleasure to remedy sadness. If by my apathetic behavior I avoid spiritual goods like my friendship with God and others because they require that I make some sacrifice, and I instead seek pleasure to diminish my sadness, I'll find over time that even the pleasures I seek as an escape become diminished. This is because I'm using the pleasant thing to escape rather than properly and wholeheartedly enjoying it. Let me make a qualification at this point. Sometimes there are actions that love requires that we don't have the energy or other resources needed to perform well. Avoiding them temporarily is not apathy, but good sense. It's reasonable to wait for the right time to face difficult things, although we can sometimes be subject to self-deception here. In summary, spiritual apathy is damaging to friendship because by it I resist loving as friendship requires. I can become angry at those who call me to do good because that reminder renews my sadness. But by being a good friend and developing good friendships, being a good friend and developing good friends is crucial to happiness, and so we should work against spiritual apathy. How can we work against spiritual apathy specifically? First, recognize that friendships are crucial to happiness, and that to be a good friend, one must sometimes sacrifice one's own comfort and pleasures for the good of the friend. Second, find ways to cultivate love for your friends when you see it's lacking. For example, even if you're not feeling it, doing the loving thing over time will help. The 4th century monk Evagrius and the Benedictine monastic tradition recommends practicing stability of place, a third remedy. This means that I stay put. I don't try to escape. I face the issue that's causing my sadness and resolve it to the best of my ability. It is very easy to escape today. We have a highly mobile society and an almost infinite number of amusements on our fingertips. Sometimes it's reasonable to move on, but we should resist doing so when we're really running from what love is calling us to do. Fourth and finally, this requires perseverance, which is another remedy for apathy. Evagrius writes in his 8 Thoughts that perseverance is the cure for apathy, along with the execution of all tasks with great attention. So perseverance and cultivating great attention. It's not enough to stay put. A person must stay the course and resolutely attend to the tasks that will foster that love that is lacking. In these ways, we can grow to be more loving and better friends. The next vice that undermines friendship is envy, which is contrary to charity. What is envy? Aquinas defines envy as sadness at the good of another, insofar as the good of another is seen as an impediment to one's own excellence. Let's unpack this definition. Sadness here, like in spiritual apathy, can refer to 2 different things. On the one hand, it can refer to a free, deliberate withdrawing from willing someone's good. On the other hand, sadness can refer to emotional distress. How can we be sad over another's good? In the case of envy, we perceive the truly good thing that causes sadness in us to be bad. We're distressed when we perceive that someone else is getting some good thing diminishes our own excellence. Because we treat the other's good as something that takes away our own good, we treat what is good for them as bad for us, which is why we feel sad. And hence, in envy, the other's good makes me sad. Consider an example. Suppose my friend gets a better grade than me on a test, and I feel saddened at her having gotten that grade. I begin to wish she hadn't gotten that grade, but instead that she'd gotten a lower grade than me. That's envy. What's going on? I'm upset because she got a higher grade than me. Perhaps her getting the grade makes me feel inferior to her. Perhaps I just really wanted to be the top of the class and she beat me to it. Either way, her higher score is the source of my distress, and so I begin to wish that she would never get that grade, even though it was good for her to do so. I may even begin to make excuses for why I didn't score higher, or attribute her good grade to luck, when it was really the result of her hard work. The genuine good of another, her growth, accomplishments, and so on, contributes to her flourishing. And if I love her, or at least have a basic goodwill towards her, I should rejoice in her good, or at least not be pained by it, and wish she didn't have it. But envy is contrary to this goodwill. When I envy a person, I withdraw from her good rather than willing it. I'm pained and distressed by her having the good and wish she didn't. Before unpacking further these negative effects, it's worth distinguishing envy from something that is good but that seems like envy. Suppose a friend of yours works hard over the summer and saves up enough money to go on a trip, and he posts his adventures on social media. And when you see them, you have a mixed reaction. On the one hand, you're glad for him to have had the trip. But on the other hand, you feel sad that you didn't have a trip like that. Is that envy? No. Aquinas, following Aristotle, distinguishes envy from something that looks like it that's called zeal. Aquinas writes that zeal is, quote, when persons are saddened at the fact that they themselves do not have good things that their neighbor does, end quote. The zealous person then seeks to imitate the other so that he can attain the goods too. So you may work hard to save up so that you can go on a trip like your friend. Zeal is different from envy, for the envious person is saddened at the fact that their neighbor has good things that they don't have. The difference is very subtle. Zeal is sadness that I lack a good another has, without sadness that the other has it. You see that? In contrast, the envious is saddened that the other has it, and so they are glad if the other loses it. right? You rejoice when they lose it. Zeal is consistent with loving the other and willing them to have good. But envy is inconsistent with loving the other, for the envious wishes the other didn't have the good. They want it to be taken. What are some of the bad effects of envy? Well, the first is that it undermines charity. Charity toward others requires that we will their good. It's a failure of goodwill to respond negatively to the real good of another. But that's exactly what happens in envy. For those who played sports, think of when you were young and you were taught good sportsmanship. At the end of the game, you went out to shake hands with the opposing team and you told them, "Good game." The poor sport was the one who sulked and fumed over a loss and wouldn't shake hands with the other team. The poor sulk refused to will the good of the other. The poor sport was in the grip of envy. Envy makes it harder to love a friend that you envy and harder to be a good friend. It's difficult to be around people who are sources of sadness to us, and it's difficult to have friendships that are marked by a need to be superior to your friend. Envy also begets offspring such as gossip and detraction. The envious may attempt to tear down the person that they envy and show that she's not as good as others think. The envious gossips when he disparages the one he envies in a secret or disguised way, but he tears them down openly by detraction. The envious does this because he thinks tearing down the others will remedy his sadness. Unfortunately, envy doesn't stop here. It can degenerate into hatred for the other person. In this context, to hate the other is to wish for the other's misfortune. Absolutely. For example, envy may start in an athlete because someone else fairly beat him for a starting spot on the team. Hate results when he not only wishes that the other wouldn't have that spot, but when he wishes that bad things would happen to that person altogether. This leads the envier to exult or rejoice at the other's adversity, say if the other seems to get a serious injury or something really bad happens to him, or to distress if the envied person prospers, say if further examination by the doctor reveals the injury isn't serious, or if something really good happens to him. The hateful person is worse than the envious because they are totally set against the other's good, rather than just in one way. So how can we avoid envy and work against it? Envy stems from a comparative sense of self-value, to use DeYoung's phrase, or an excessive desire to be the best, or both. To combat envy, we have to disconnect our sense of value from a winning comparison with others. A comparative sense of self-value is easy to come by in our culture. We see that material rewards often go to the winners, and if we don't have a clear sense for what gives us value, we can take false consolation in the thought that at least we're better than the next guy. A more robust sense of self-value will be rooted in one's own intrinsic value, stemming from one's nature, unique traits, and gifts that one has received, and from being loved by God. These sources of value don't depend on winning comparisons with others. A second remedy is to pay attention to and cultivate concern for the goods we share with others rather than the competitive goods or the goods that we compete over. For example, when I share knowledge or an experience of beauty with someone, I don't lose any of that knowledge or that experience. I can't envy a person if her having a good doesn't diminish my having it. A third and final remedy is to practice good zeal. Focus on what you can do to become better and try to love the one you're tempted to envy and imitate him so that you can be worthy of the good that he has or she has. I will conclude this talk with a discussion of one more virtue, an application of the virtue of prudence to friendship. Prudence is wisdom about what is to be done. In particular, I want to focus on how a friend is both loving and wise in helping her friend to know himself and to avoid mistakes by correcting him. Correcting our friends poorly can result in losing them, so we want to be wise when doing so. And so let's learn from Aquinas' wise advice in this matter from his Summa Theologiae. Aquinas discusses fraternal correction or friendly reproof, in which we confront our friends about something that they have already done or something they are planning to do that is wrong. A true friend loves us for our own sake and wants us to flourish. But wrong actions always wound us and detract from our flourishing. So a good friend will help us in this way at times. He or she will not always be on the lookout for sin and pry into our lives unnecessarily, but he or she will at proper times correct the friend, for love demands that we help our friends to flourish. But how do you do this well without being obnoxious or unsuccessful or even lose your friend? Fraternal correction is to correct a person's fault out of love or charity. So, love for the person and for that person's good is essential to this. And to do this properly, we have to meet 5 conditions. First, we must have good judgment about the fault. Do I see clearly? I should not seek to correct a friend on the basis of suspicion, but we must clearly understand the issue at hand. Sometimes we have to remove a log from our own eye before we can see the speck in our friends. Second, we must be motivated by love for the friend and his flourishing. Am I really doing this out of love? Am I doing it out of pride? Or do I have some ulterior motive? It has to be motivated by love. Third, we should reasonably believe that the friend trusts us. In other words, that the friend believes that, for example, I have good judgment and that I'm motivated by love for him or her. Sometimes our friends trust us in some areas of life, but not in others. Is this one in which my friend trusts me? Why does this matter? If my friend does not trust me, I will not likely succeed in correcting my friend and may make my friend worse and harm the friendship. Similarly, if I've corrected them too frequently already, the friend may be unwilling to listen again. And such failures conflict with the loving motivation that impels me to correct them in the first place. I want them to improve and not get worse, which they will be if they blow me off or if I harm the friendship. Fourth, we must correct when our friend is in a place to receive it. Usually, we should not correct a friend when they're exhausted, depressed, angry, or in a mood that makes them unlikely to receive it. Furthermore, we should not correct them, generally, in public or in front of others. The virtues of justice and love require us to be sensitive to their reputation and to protect that important good out of love for them. That doesn't mean there are not cases where public correction might be necessary, but because of the urgency of the situation, but they're not typical, I think. In summary, then, we should ask, are these the right circumstances? Fifth, and finally, in light of these considerations, we must determine whether we have a reasonable hope that our friend will receive the correction. In these circumstances, rather than reject it, injure our friendship, or become worse. If I think it will likely make them worse, then love bids me to refrain from correcting them. That's why prudence is needed, and love is absolutely essential for correcting a friend. As should be clear, a good friend helps the friend to know himself, including his faults. But this is not motivated by judgmentalism, but by love for the friend. Such friends together will flourish because they will charitably help each other to pursue a more fulfilling life and become partners in a pursuit of happiness that benefits them both. In summary and conclusion, we should all seek to avoid spiritual apathy and envy and grow in charity and practical wisdom. And to do so and be a good friend, here are 10 tips. Number 1, my top 10 list. Pursue an adequate vision of human flourishing. Number 2, remember what makes for a good friend. Number 3, recognize the true value of good friendship. Number 4, love your friend primarily for his or her own sake, not because they're pleasant or useful to you. Number 5, practice stability of place, don't run away. Number 6, persevere in doing what love demands even when you don't feel like it. Number 7, don't seek self-value from a winning comparison with others. Number 8, pursue shared goods. Number 9, practice zeal. Number 10, wisely correct your friend from love with good judgment in the right circumstances. Doing so will help you be a good friend and build the kind of friendships that will enable you to flourish together. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions. Oh, yeah. Testing. It's okay. Be loud.
Yeah, so we'll open up the floor for questions for about 10, 15 minutes. Just raise your hand and we'll throw the mic at you.
I'm just going to throw it to you anyway. And hopefully it'll be on by the time
All right.
you stop.
So is this working? Nope. Not working.
It's okay. Just go for it.
So, assuming one takes into account everything you said, and that individual finds out that they don't have friends leading them towards the good.
Yeah.
What next?
Yeah. So this is a case where they have friends, but their friends are not leading them to the good, or they don't have friends at all.
First option.
Yeah. They need to find friends, other friends. I mean, that doesn't mean that they can't still maintain some relationships. It kind of depends. Sometimes we're in friendships that are pretty toxic and pretty bad for us, and we might not have the resources to really spend a lot of time with that person without them leading us to sin and things that are bad for us. In other cases, we might be able to maintain a friendly relationship with a person because they don't tempt us or they're not bad for us in that way, but we won't be able to enjoy the deep friendships I'm trying to get at with that person if they have like really radically different visions of life and so on. And I think if a person is sort of experiencing friendships of pleasure and utility and they're enjoying those, but they don't have any good friends, then they should be alert to that that's a need of theirs. And so they should be on the eye for that. And if they think like, you know what, it's not going to happen with this group, then they need to look elsewhere, I think. I mean, it could be that it happens with somebody in the group if they have the same yearning and they've discovered, because, and I didn't mention this here, but many, many times our good friends arise from friendships of pleasure or usefulness. Does that make sense? You all enjoy doing something together and you hang out and you really enjoy each other. And then you realize you connect at a deeper level and you have a lot in common. All of a sudden a deeper friendship forms. But it was started because you all like playing Ultimate Frisbee together or whatever, right? Or maybe you're all working on some project. So I'm not saying, and Aristotle's not saying that they're bad. And they're often the occasion for the development of it. But if you're in a situation where your friends are actually just like, there's not really a chance for that in them, then you just got to pray for them, help them as you can, and then find it somewhere else. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. Testing. Yeah. Even if it doesn't work, it's kind of fun to throw it.
So, kind of piggybacking off of that point,
Mm-hmm.
at the outset of meeting someone, is it bad to be like, okay, I'm not going to be able to pursue a complete friendship with this person, intentionally pursue an incomplete friendship of pleasure or utility with someone, and how do you determine that? How do you use prudence to determine that in various situations?
That's great. So let's distinguish between a person who's using another person and a person who's being a friend. So Aristotle, I think, is not. It might be that there could be mutual, there could be use in a way that he would say is not doesn't rise to the level of what we would call a friendship. Does that make sense? So for example, you might have a friendship with a mechanic that you take your car to, or with a teacher that you learn from. And it might be that friendship is, or you might have like a study partner, and you guys say, hey, you know what, let's study together. And you do that. And it's mutually beneficial. You're not using each other. It's not manipulative. You both recognize that's what the relationship's about. And then afterward, you might not hang out much with them because that was for a time. So it comes into being and it goes out of being. That would be a healthy friendship of utility. And you might not need to expect anything more of that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Aristotle thinks, though, that where it gets problematic is when one person is sort of simulating wanting to be a good friend or a deeper friend, and but they're really just treating the other person as a means. And sometimes this would be like a malicious act, and Aristotle thinks this is one of the worst things you can do. Better to beat a person up and take all their money than actually kind of betray what friendship is. But sometimes what happens is people get together and they enjoy each other's company, and their friendship is a friendship of enjoyment. But one person thinks it's deeper, and the other person doesn't. And he says most conflict in friendship arises from disagreements or misunderstandings of what their relationship actually is. So it's kind of like a define the relationship sort of point. Yeah, for friends. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Great.
Do you think that there is a necessity in the third level of friendship to be what I would call, quote unquote, a
person? And if so, do you think that there is a lack of deeper people in the world?
Can you define what you mean by deeper person?
Well, I was hoping that you might say what Aristotle would say about that, but I guess what I mean is there are some people that I find I can't talk to them about much else other than the weather, or
Yeah.
so-and-so died last week, so we went to their funeral, and then we're going to go to Arizona, and, you know. Like,
Yeah, I understand.
You see what I'm saying? And
I
then
think so.
Some people just don't seem to have the possibility to have a deeper conversation.
Yeah. I guess I want to distinguish maybe between a simple person and a shallow person. Because there might be people that are very simple, and they might not talk about a lot, and they maybe can't debate, a bunch of philosophy with you because they don't have the education for it. But they could still have a depth to them that's just not disclosed by their ability to have a really great conversation with you. And then there's some people that are shallow people, and that means that they're basically living for enjoyment or money or things, and they haven't really thought about the meaning of life maybe, or about what's good. And they're just kind of going with what comes to them and acting on the basis of their impulses and emotions. And they're not really asked like really important questions, like what is my nature and what am I living for? And what would it mean for me to have a good life? And what kind of life do I want to have when I'm dead? Or look back on after I've died, or as I'm on my deathbed, I should say. So that person is shallow in a certain way. But you could have a shallow person who's sophisticated in their conversations. So they might be able to talk to you about all sorts of fun things, but they're still shallow. Does that make sense? So now, simple and shallow could go together. But you can also have a person who's, in a sense, deep and shallow. So I think if that's getting at it, I think in some ways, what are they living for? What's most important to them? What are their, what kind of character traits do you observe? Are they very loyal? Do they sort of go the extra yard to help? And I mean, you can kind of learn a lot about a person's character even if it doesn't come out in their conversation. So I guess that's maybe some things I'd say in response. Yeah. Oh man, I don't know if I can throw this from the jacket. Back row. I feel like I might hit somebody. Do you want me to try it? All right, get big guys in the middle. All right.
Can you kind of speak to the difference in circumstances where we've had friends for a long time and a deep relationship with them, and then for whatever reason they start showing toxic tendencies or something,
Yeah.
they start acting that way, and we're put in this choice almost where it feels like do you kind of go in self-love and self-preservation, or self-sacrifice and sticking with them even though they're displaying these really horrible habits and vices.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things to say. Sometimes people are really close to a person, but their closeness is based on their experiences together. And they haven't really developed a complete friendship, but they think they have it. So think about times you might have a really close set of friends from high school, and you all lived in the same neighborhood, and you hung out together, and you had a lot of enjoyable times together, and you know them really well. And then you all go away to college, and then after college, you maybe text them once a year or something. You see what I'm saying? What happened? You guys were together for a decade of your life growing up, and now you get a Christmas card from them, and that's about it. You could say I think what happens there is that the friendship was circumstantial, based on enjoyment and your own developing together, and it's a good thing. That's a good thing. Those friendships are good, but they're not, I think, maybe necessarily good friendships in the technical way I was talking about here. They could be, they could not be. But often what happens is people change, and then the circumstances don't push them together, and so they don't continue to foster that. But the other one would be cases where you do have a good friendship in the sense I was talking about here, a complete friendship. And then you have that kind of friendship, and then you are apart for a while, and then one of them changes, one of the parties change, and you come back together, and you kind of realize that you're different. Now maybe one person is really all about money, and they don't want to talk about anything but what's useful to getting more money. And the other person was about a lot of other stuff. And so then there's this question, what happened to the friendship? So Aristotle has this idea that when friendships go apart, or when friends go apart, the friendship goes to sleep. And then when they get back together, you kind of figure out whether it wakes up or just stays dead. But what happens is that he thinks you have, out of a kind of duty to your friend out because of your past relationship with them to like care for them and to do what you can for them. But you might no longer have the basis for what was that tight friendship because you've become different in your character and in your ultimate goals. Does that make sense? Do you want to follow up? You can follow up. Yeah. Okay, you got it. Just ask a question.
All right. So you talked a lot about willing the good of another,
Yeah.
and sort of love as a choice and not just an emotion. But I think that, like, especially in our secular world today, like college life can sometimes also be characterized by a kind of despair. And so people, instead of like learning how to love themselves, just bury themselves in trying to love others as a way for like making up what they think is lacking in themselves.
Yeah.
And so what do you think is like the virtuous mean between, like, you do have to come out of yourself in order to realize yourself, like, you know, in the truest sense, right?
Yeah.
You can't do it by yourself. But you also can't truly love someone unless you love yourself.
Yeah.
So what does virtue look like? Not just like, you know, to what extent do you fake it till you make it, and to what extent do you have to focus on, you know, not just cultivating these virtues in interpersonal relationships, but also like in your own interior?
Yeah, that's great. So Aristotle distinguishes two kinds of self-love. There's the self-lovers, and that's the term where you say that person really loves himself, and that's a negative thing. And then there's this person loves himself, and that's a positive thing. So we got to distinguish between positive and negative, or good and bad self-love. So the bad self-lover is the person who's just really selfish or self-centered, and it's all about them. The good self-lover is the person who desires the best things for themselves, and they pursue them. And the best things for them are virtue and knowledge and friendships. And, you know, it could extend to health. Like, if people don't take care of their health, they're not able to meet their friends where they are, like sleep. There's all sorts of, there's like basic bodily things you have to take care of, and then there's mental things, and then, you know, other psychological things. And so it's all kind of built on each other. I think it's kind of funny. Aristotle, I think, doesn't have anything like the modern world sort of despairing personality in mind, whereas it's much more common for us. And some of it is perhaps a result of, well, yeah. I was just thinking about, as I was talking about the focus on the remedy of apathy involving perseverance and attention, and the way in which the attention part really struck me this time as I was reading it, because I'm thinking about like how distracted we are. And when you're distracted, you don't accomplish your goals as clearly, and you tend to multiply goals. And so if you think about self-love as a priority, and you're clearly accomplishing it in a reasonable way, with attention, you're likely to be in a better place to enact some of these other focused virtues. But if you're totally distracted and you can hardly handle it yourself, then it's going to be harder for you to be a good friend.
Thanks.
Yeah. Go ahead. He can walk it up, rather than throwing it over your heads without you seeing
Nail
it.
someone in the back of the head.
Yeah, that's smart. There we go.
So when it's time, or when you see something in a friend that you want to charitably call out
Yeah.
as being wrong,
Yeah.
and I think you listed 5 conditions that you have to meet to do that.
Yeah.
If there's risk that that friend is going to be offended by you calling him or her out, is it truly better to not do anything at all? Or is it better to take some action to repair whatever's lacking?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So suppose, this is just a made-up example. Suppose I know my brother really well. And suppose he has a temper. He doesn't really, so this doesn't apply. But just imagine this other brother. Suppose I know that if I confront him on something, he's going to hit me in the face. But I also know that 2 minutes later, he's going to apologize and he'll listen. So I might know he's going to be offended, he's going to have a violent response, he's going to hit me, but I also know, because of experience, that it's going to be fine a couple minutes later and we're going to have a great conversation. Then I should do it. Because now or maybe I have a good reason to believe I should. So you could say, you know your friend's going to be initially offended, but you also know that they're going to take it seriously maybe with some time. The key is you're going to be motivated, like, what is actually best for my friend? That's what you're thinking. Because if you think, I think he might be offended, but I also think that we're going to be able to like actually have a great conversation, and if I do nothing, then nothing will ever happen, then that might make you reasonably hopeful that you'll succeed, even if there's a short-term apparent setback, but it actually results in success. Now, you can't know these things perfectly because it's about free choices. But you have to have reasonable hope, I think. If you just think, you know, there's not really a prayer that he's going to respond, he's going to be really offended, but I feel a duty, I should do it. That's actually that's being motivated more by a sense of justice. And that's a different kind of correction. And sometimes we're in a place where we have to act out of justice, but sometimes we're not. And I think what I'm talking about is when you correct a friend, you're not often in a place where justice requires it, but you are in a place where love requires it, but you have to make sure that it's actually better for them, which is what you want in love, right? So basically, I think initial negative responses don't rule out, but you have to think about what your reasonable hope of success is as things unfold. Am I answering your question, you think, or not?
Yes, yes you are.
Yeah. That's at least how I'd say it. I mean, might be wiser people here that could say more. Oh, you got one more? All right.
You mentioned in your top 10 tips.
Top 10, yeah.
Pursue shared goods.
Yeah.
What is a shared good between friends?
Yeah. So watching a movie, going on a walk, reading philosophy, talking about philosophy, going to like view art together. Like basically, it's any good that you can share and that you're having in it doesn't take anything away from them having it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Good question.